Hello again everyone, I hope you're all keeping well. In this video I'm going to be talking about why metaphysics matters. Metaphysical statements or ideas aren't formulated as truth claims. In fact, there is no truth to be found in them as such, at least not as is defined by the logical analysts, because such statements can't be falsified or tested using any objective means or measure. So by that standard, they are nonsense. However, and this is quite important, the logical analysts like Carnap back in 1932 made the claim that they are meaningless nonsense, and this is patently false. It's a patently false assertion to say that metaphysics is meaningless. At the very least, metaphysical ideas give mythical expression to the reality of our creative intelligence, which is both an aspect of each individual's inner subjective imagination, but also can reasonably be said to be part of our shared cultural or habitual reality. And the resultants of such expressions in an external reality can be tested, they can be studied, and they can be falsified through inquiry. Put simply, how we perceive, think, process, and interact with all other processes which are occurring in the vastness of existence hints at possible future expressions of human behaviour, be it individually or on a societal level. Fables, poems, fairy tales, music, and all other forms of art are a product of our creative minds. They impute sequential feelings, thoughts, abstract notions in the mind of the listener, reader, viewer, and so on. In fact, there's an overarching meta-reality to them. They are telling a story. There's no inherent truth in the analytical, rational sense to be found in them, yet they feel more real than objective, pure facts. I would go so far as to say that any datum, any piece of raw data, information that hasn't been processed, is about as useful as a turnip. Because you see, there's no inherent coherent story to it all until we start telling it. We have to interpret the data. Now, this is a very unusual and tough concept for us to get our heads around many a time, partly because of the unintentional failure of the rationalists like Locke and the empiricists like Hume, but mostly because of postmodernist thought, which has weaved itself into every facet of human life. Everywhere you look now, postmodernist thought is growing, and it has been for many a decade, right? And this is because, it's because of a lot of reasons, but why this is the case in current times is to do with the actually, we'll get to this later on, I think. I'll leave this for the time being and I'll get back to it. But the postmodernist assertion is that metaphysics does not exist, that it is an invention, a social construct, which therefore has to be deconstructed. But I'll tell you that we deconstruct it at our peril, for reasons again I'll go into later on when we're covering how postmodernist thought flourished. In fact, let's talk about this. So the first thing to understand is how philosophy evolved in Europe. In the course of the evolution of philosophy in Europe, we seem to have loosely gone in the following direction through the last 1,000 or so years. Pantheism to some form of reason through Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, then to monotheism with a central monarchic full authority figure of a pope espousing belief through blind faith and obedience and domination, then back to reason through Bacon, Locke, and Descartes, who challenged the definitive authoritative truth claims that were made by the church, which were of a supernatural nature. Then we have the schism developing between rationalism and empiricism, and this concerned the extent to which we are dependent upon our sense experience in an effort to gain knowledge. Then we had the development of the hard sciences and the political theorems based around natural rights, the natural rights of the individual, such as Locke's separation of power between church and state, or Bastiat's The Law, and both men concerned themselves with natural law. Then we saw disciplines like engineering, medicine, and so on, chemistry, all become more refined, shall we say, in their conceptual framework. And we also saw classical liberalism and capitalism politically take off, and economically, capitalism, as described by Adam Smith, that became the ideal for much of Western Europe. And from all of this developed the ideals of freedom, which was at the time of the Enlightenment seen as inextricably linked to wealth, material property, and health. The thinking here was that prosperity in each of these areas would lead to eudaimonia. Now, this is a very difficult word to translate from Greek into the English language. Roughly, it would translate as follows: striving to achieve the best outcome you can morally and materially, which meant that you would be engaged in the pursuit of happiness, and from that happiness you would derive spiritual contentment. Now, we'll get to what happiness in this context actually means in a second. You've no doubt heard the phrase, the pursuit of happiness, before. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is a well-known phrase in the American Declaration of Independence. Happiness in the context that the Founding Fathers were speaking about it, and also in the context of these rationalist philosophers, meant spiritual contentment due to right moral action and wealth creation. Okay? On a related note, by the way, I'll tell you this: people misunderstand the term wealth itself. It doesn't just relate to money. You can be wealthy in any arena, okay? Many facets of life. But for reasons that have to do with the fact that the rationalists got torn down, what ended up happening was that materialism, in its worst aspects, became unbridled. It was unchained from any moral structure. But let's get back to the theme of what we were speaking about here. So all of these philosophers from the Enlightenment period are retrospectively called the modernists. They had to pose and answer questions on metaphysics, epistemology, human nature, ethics, politics, and economics, the latter two being inextricably linked. These philosophers, the modernists, were proponents of realism, naturalism, objectivism through experience and reason. They developed the idea of blank slate theory and then debated it. They championed individualism and liberal capitalism as their tenets. But then along comes Immanuel Kant in the late 1700s and starts asking some very unsettling questions for modernist philosophy. How can we really know something? Now, on the face of it, that sounds like a really simple question, but when you start drilling deep into it, you start asking, well, what is gnosis? Who's doing the knowing? Where is the line between subject and object? And why can't the philosophy of reason provide a more robust understanding of metaphysical understandings? Okay, metaphysical ideas. Now, I'm oversimplifying here, but you get the general gist of it, I think. Kant is regarded as the most important philosopher to have emerged in the last 200 years easily. Okay? And because he asked these pertinent questions, this led to the rise of the irrationalists like Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Heidegger. So, a brief outline of what these guys thought in their philosophies, let's say. Kierkegaard's general hypothesis was that reason couldn't get you any nearer to any form of ultimate reality, and that only the absurd could help us understand chaos, because the universe, you see, can be quite chaotic. There's a lot of order in it naturally, but there's also naturally a lot of chaos in it. There's a balance between these two, right? And this shows itself in every area of existence, I would say. And that includes the human experience. We have to mediate between chaos and order all the time. Now, again, I'm simplifying here for brevity. Okay, so you can read more about Kierkegaard's ideas yourself and then form your own notions about what he was saying. But Nietzsche thought that it was futile to use reason to grasp reality. And this is because reason can only take you so far, but it takes you in one direction. It answers one part of the question, which is to do with the natural order of things, but it doesn't actually address the chaotic part of it. Okay? And Heidegger, who was a really interesting philosopher, came to the conclusion that logic would disintegrate in the face of contradiction, even though contradiction may itself be the basis of reality proper. Basically what he was saying was that although the principles of logic are very useful, they take you up to a certain point, but then if you use those to say, well, existence can't be contradictory, and you find that existence is contradictory, then logic blows itself apart. Okay? It's sort of like what we're finding in quantum mechanics, that reality both is and is not. Well, this seems contradictory. And so trying to apply logical principles to existence can't really be done. It's not truly a way to describe the universe even, or our place in it, or anything else, right? You can't use logic for any of that. So Heidegger found reason to be totally flawed, and because of this he said that the age of reason had come to an end. It was dead, right? All three of these irrationalists realized the seriousness of the problem that would burst forth from the fact that reason was inadequate in answering the real questions. Okay? And this was a dangerous pivotal moment in Western civilization and in human history as well. Because you see, what had happened was we started off with these supernatural truth claims being made. Then we shifted to a more rational age. Then we shifted back to a form of monotheism, which was really a monarchic system, but which made truth claims based on faith. Then we had the pre-modern age, then the modern age, and then, as Nietzsche put it, God is dead. God was dead, right? But now what happens is, well, not only is God dead, but the age of reason is dead as well, because it was insufficient philosophically. And so we come to the last 100 years, where Europe and its civilization became devoid of all meaning, and the nihilistic savagery that consumed Western Europe and the European mind was just immense. And it was during that time that a seed of pure evil, let's say, germinated and took root in the fertile soil of a defeated continent, and that was socialism. We also had the rise of fascism proper, and Marxism, and later communism. This all developed because a void had formed, and these ideologies sought to fill that void. Okay? Marx himself believed that the climax of philosophical wisdom was politics and not necessarily ethics. Although he still provided some ethical framework, it's very flawed. You can read it in his work, and you'll see that more or less he pretty much dismisses epistemology, metaphysics, the study of human nature, and so on. His primary concern was with theories of political and economic power, because he believed that the existential crisis of Europe had been caused by the Enlightenment. Okay? And also he blamed capitalism for this, when in fact it was actually due to a natural evolution of thought. Right? These are the phases. By the way, a lot of people will be critical about why all of this happened, but the way I see it, okay, and I don't know if I'm seeing it correctly necessarily, but the way I see it, it's a necessary thing for society to go through all of this and then to find itself, right? Sometimes you do have to go through a process of looking at what you believe and why you believe it, right? This introspection. The mistake that was made was that the supplanting ideology pretended to be a philosophy, and then, as I say, it germinated in the European mind. This being socialism and communism, right? As I said before in one of my previous videos, communism was an offshoot of socialism, not the other way around, okay? Now, all of this, everything that had happened historically in the arena of philosophy had coloured Marx's perception of the world at large. And while European philosophy was trying to get its wind back so that it could answer these existential questions, he blasted it with all guns blazing. And for a time he actually succeeded, as did those who followed after him. But the collapse of Russia and the later discovered brutalities of Marx's utopia made real through Soviet communism, the USSR, that spoke for itself. You see, Marx had made all these bold predictions about capitalism, how it would fail because the foundational principles were exploitative and so on. Well, what he never, or perhaps he did see this, but who knows, communism ended up being the more exploitative ideology, right? And it became an ideology as opposed to a philosophy. And there is a difference between these two things. You see, a philosophy tries to answer the questions of why. An ideology doesn't bother with that. An ideology just tells you what it says, and it's unquestioned, right? It can't be questioned, it's unquestionable. Otherwise, the boot of authority will come down on your face. That's basically what all ideologies ultimately try and do. But Marx, of course, was wrong about capitalism. It didn't fail. Political and economic theorems themselves were not enough to address the metaphysical questions, and for this reason, communism didn't succeed. It wasn't a paradise, it was hellish. Okay? So this brings us to the postmodernists. Lyotard, Foucault, Derrida, Rorty, and many others. Now, Foucault in particular was massively influential, and he was remarkably gifted, and he was also a rather brilliant thinker. But due to his political persuasions, he, like Marx, came to believe that the only useful lens for looking at the world was that of power. The dynamics of power and how normative power plays out in everyday interactions were his sole focus. He completely ignored the idea that metaphysics could enter into that or anything else, right? Anything that didn't suit his point of view, he dismissed. And that included the fact that all human societies require meta-narratives in order to function properly. Myth-making is central to our being, and the proof of this is in the pudding. There has never been a human society that didn't hold to meta-narratives about itself, and meta-narratives are they're an expression of metaphysical reality, right? And we'll get into that a little bit more, but there's never been a society that hadn't held meta-narratives about itself. And if a society emerged that didn't, it would actually cease to be. And there are complicated reasons behind this. But that's the basis, I think, for why the goal of the postmodernists was to deconstruct civilizational narratives for political reasons. Each of them, incidentally, okay, it's a curious oddity that every single postmodernist philosopher, we call them philosophers loosely because they didn't actually answer philosophical questions. They were more ideologues, I would say. But each of the postmodernists was an avowed communist, which is bizarre. And the reason it's bizarre is because in any discipline you would expect to have a multitude of different ideas, right? People holding to differing beliefs, but not so with postmodernism, right? Or what's termed as postmodernism. And this is really bizarre that they leaned so much towards communism, especially when Foucault himself knew about the brutalities that had happened in Soviet Russia and the brutalities which were happening in Mao's China, which he supported. And the reason it's bizarre is because Foucault also had very strong anti-authoritarian ideas. Okay? He had a very anti-authoritarian bent in a lot of his works. So for him to support authoritarianism is, at the very least, seriously hypocritical. So his main aim seems to have only been to knock down authority in Western civilization. He never turned that gaze in any proper way towards regimes that were truly making their people suffer if they aligned with his political views. But anyway, let's put that aside. So this is the evolution of how postmodernism came to rise to the top, and you had all this infiltration of the academies, and so people were distributing all this work from all these deconstructionist thinkers. So you know, this happens. And then we get the idea that, well, the fully formed idea that developed then was that metaphysics is not worthy as a part of philosophy. It shouldn't be studied. Okay? It shouldn't be studied. And this is why, you know, it all became about, it just descended into becoming about power politics. It's a very, very dangerous thing, and we can see the results of a lot of this stuff, you know. But even so, you know, myth-making, storytelling, which is the meta-narrative, which I've been talking about, right, has been absolutely essential in helping our ancestors to construct civilizations, and without them we would have been utterly lost. These meta-narratives have recognizable characters and characteristics, like I said, both for individuals and for groups. And these characteristics are what Carl Jung called archetypes. And the meta-narratives themselves rise up from the mists of what Jung called the collective unconscious. And he wasn't alone in this realization. Before him, Socrates, Immanuel Kant, Plato, and eventually Wittgenstein understood that certain expressions of reality can only be expressed through myth and metaphor. Okay? And that's a profound realization, and you'll grasp why as you think about it. Nation states, global projects, small communities, empires all engage in myth-making. In the simplest form, this might be what we call a stereotype. Okay, stereotypes evolved from myth-making because we have to tell ourselves stories about people or places or whatever else, right? Now, in its most insidious form, the meta-narrative or the myth becomes propaganda, right? And this is the thing. Propaganda is a meta-narrative that is used, that is to say, a metaphysical reality, an expression of metaphysical reality, which is distorted, okay, purposefully, in order to misuse that. Do you see what I'm saying? And that actually relates to dark occultism for reasons which I won't go into here. But one need only look through history to understand why meta-narratives are so important and why metaphysics is so important. Because any such expression, as I keep repeating, is grounded in metaphysics. So the question then becomes, which myths do we tell ourselves? The most beneficial and useful, or the most damaging and harmful? Right? For a myth to help us attain eudaimonia in our current times, it must satisfy certain criteria. It must be of use, and it must, at the very least, not cause us psychological, ecological, sociological, or physiological damage, neither to ourselves or to others. But such a myth does not presently exist. It's the holy grail, if you like, and I'm being metaphorical there, right? But that's conjuring up all kinds of images for you, expressing a certain meta-reality. We haven't stumbled onto that yet, that type of myth. Okay? But isn't it interesting, as an aside, that Arthurian legend, Grail lore, biblical scripture, Greek mythos, and Hindu mysticism are all a search for that meta-narrative? It's almost as if those ancient stories are hinting at the fact there's a better story that we haven't yet told ourselves, but which is waiting in the wings to be expressed. Okay? So I hope I've sort of managed to explain well. I don't know if I've succeeded in this or not, but I hope I've managed to explain why metaphysics is meaningful. It's full of meaningfulness. It is not meaningless. Okay? Anyway, I'm going to leave it there for this presentation, but I want to thank you very much for watching. Take good care of yourselves, and God bless every one of you.